to get us live to Facebook.
Okay. Make sure my phone is go on. Okay. Great.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the book club at the center, the Birchfield Penny Arts Center's monthly book club meeting. I can't tell you how excited I am to welcome tonight's author, Buffalo-born Ed Park, featuring his virgin novel, Personal Days. For those of you joining us for the first time, my name is Mary Kozub, and I am an educator at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center. One of the best parts of my job is running this book club, which began over 12 years ago as a docent initiative. We started by reading books read and admired by our own Charlie Birchfield in order to deepen our understanding of the man and the artist. But soon we began reading books by other regional is the right word, authors, a practice that supports the center's mission to celebrate the many talents and achievements within our own Western New York community. Even though some of them have moved to Manhattan, I'm just saying. Since that time, we have welcomed over 60 authors as we welcome Ed this evening. I am now going to turn things over to my colleague, Michaela Woros, who will explain the mechanics of the evening. Michaela?
Hi, everyone. So for those who are unfamiliar or new to our book club, for this portion, we will have a Q&A with the author. So please put your questions in the Q&A section. I will read them on your behalf. And please use the chat section to talk amongst yourselves. This meeting is being recorded, but only the panelists are being recorded. But if you do have to leave this meeting early, you can always request a copy of this recording. And we are on live to Facebook. So if you are watching on Facebook, use the comment section there, and I will be monitoring those and ask those questions too.
Thank you, Michaela. Now I'd like to introduce someone I just met this evening, Ian Bletcher. Ian joined one of our book clubs. Actually, it was The Fourth Child, written by Jessica Winter. And as a fan of Ed Park's, he reached out to me and asked if I would allow him to facilitate tonight's discussion. Of course, those of you who are regulars know I'm always looking for facilitators, so I was more than excited to have someone new. I always like new voices in on the conversation join us, and he has, so I really want to thank you, Ian. And thank you, Michaela, for explaining how the night will go. And Ian, I'm going to turn it over to you. If you'd be kind enough to introduce Ed Parks to us, I'd be most appreciative.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for having me. And thank you to Ed Park for making himself available to all of us. I'm going to begin just by saying a little bit about Ed Park. It feels a little weird to give someone's biography when they are sort of in the same room, but I guess he can offer corrections if I get anything wrong. Ed Park was born in Buffalo in 1970. His family still lives there. He appears to be some kind of a fan of the Buffalo Sabres and hopes for their return to glory at any time in the near future. He is a graduate of Yale and Columbia. He was a founding editor of The Believer, one of my favorite literary magazines, and the editor of the Voice Literary Supplement in New York. And he has said publicly that his experiences there, waves of layoffs, deteriorating morale, shifting alliances, anticipating the sale of the company, helped to inspire his portrayal of a struggling company in Personal Days. After The Voice, he worked as an editor at the Poetry Foundation and elsewhere. His work has appeared in the New York Times, Book Forum, the LA Times, and he himself appears in the Blu-ray edition of the Coen Brothers film True Grit, discussing Charles Portis, who, you can correct me if I'm wrong, is one of his favorite writers. He is Finally, the editor of and a contributor to Buffalo Noir, a collection of dark short stories about Buffalo. Personal Days was originally published by Random House in May 2008. We are discussing it now, I imagine, because this novel of The Office is at a strange crossroads in the history of recent literature, since novels about offices appeared with some frequency at a certain point, and now lots of people are no longer working in them. So maybe we can ask, to start with, whether these novels have any future, or whether we're going to read them the way we read, I don't know, period pieces by Edith Wharton or Henry James.
I mean, it'll take a while for offices to, to die out completely, obviously. But recently, the Washington Post did a piece about the past and present and questionable future of the Office novel. And I was talking with a journalist, and I actually was getting really excited because we were, right now we're all connecting on Zoom, and I'm sure all of us, throughout this last year and a half have become adept at, Zoom and FaceTime and all these sorts of ways of meeting up virtually. And I don't know, the idea of a quote unquote office novel that's done entirely remotely, actually as a literary structure or as a literary idea, I just feel like there's so much potential. I'm not saying I'm going to do that, but somebody should write it. It just seems like a lot of fun. The chat, or, secret notes going back and forth, that not all the participants know about, breakout rooms. I just feel like there's a lot of potential for someone to write something really, really good that would be about this sort of brave new office, and yet still connect to the mini genre of novels about work. So I will be the first one to read those, if not write one myself.
One of the things that you say toward the very end of this wonderful, dark, difficult, complicated, hilarious book, Personal Days, is that The Office generates at least one novel every day in the form of correspondence and memos and reports, all the reams of numbers, hundreds of sentences, thousands of words. But no one has the mind to understand it. No one has the eyes to take it all in. And I'm curious about whether a novel can help us to take that in a way that, say, a nonfiction piece might not be able to.
Yeah, that's a good question. I remember that. It's been a while since I wrote the book, but I remember that passage, and I remember I actually remember writing that passage. Like I don't remember. There are things about this book that I don't quite recall, but the idea, even in sort of a paperless office, there's so much being communicated, like every minute of the workday, and increasingly like at all hours of the day. To have like a transcript of every word, every sentence communicated through all the different departments, like you can imagine the sheer bulk if it were to be printed out. I think it would be very hard to read. So, the novelist's job in this case is to, figure out which, obviously figure out the story, figure out the characters, select, the voices that you think are going to work in book form. But it's also, I mean, plot and stuff aside, it's also like just to, what am I trying to say? Like just to think about these things as having potential literary value. Like I think one job of the novelist is to popular forms, mass forms of communication and like use them to their advantage, right? Whether it's the language of advertising or television or the web. There are 1,000 different ways people can communicate and on the web and read on the web. So it's sort of for the office, I think that's really what I wanted to do. Just like obviously back in 2006, 7, 8, there's a lot of like email. This was well before Slack. This was well before. There actually isn't any social media, I don't think, in this book. Although I was definitely not on things like Facebook or whatever. I don't know if MySpace was still around. I didn't really do that either. But so that's kind of absent from the novel. But I was working with sort of the material I had, and certainly email alone was, a huge part of every workday back then. So
one of the things that the book does really well is to generate something sort of beautiful and funny and touching and sad out of fairly mundane workplace drama, ordinary people, relatively familiar situations. And I think that if people who are here haven't had a chance to read the book yet, they might not be able to see how this is possible without your actually reading some of it. So I wondered if I might ask you to read a bit of the book that you think might introduce people to this.
I would love to. It's been a while since I've read from it, but I'll just read a little bit from the beginning, and then I'm going to jump just a few pages and read a little bit about. We've sort of foreshadowed this, but kind of a small plot twist, or something that gets a plot going. So this is from the first section of the book. There are 3 sections, all done in different styles, but you don't need to know anything about the book. So I will read from chapter 1. Who died? On the surface, it's relaxed. There was a time when we all dressed crisply, but something's changed this summer. Now, while the weather lasts, we wear loose pants, canvas sneakers, clogs. Prue slips on flip-flops under her desk. It's so hot out, and thus every day is potentially Casual Friday. We have carte blanche to wear t-shirts featuring the comical logos of exterminating companies, advertising slogans from the early 80s. Where's the beef? We dress like we don't make much money, which is true for at least half of us. The trick is figuring out which half. We go out for drinks together 1 or 2 nights a week, sometimes 3 to take the edge off. 3 is too much. We make careful note of who buys around, who sits back and lets the booze magically appear. It's possible we can't stand each other, but at this point we're helpless in the company of outsiders. Sometimes one of the guys will come to work in a coat and tie just to freak the others out. On these days, the guard in the lobby will joke, "Who died?" And we will laugh or pretend to laugh. The Sprout. In summer, the Sprout, our boss, suggests we form a softball team. His name is actually Russell. We refer to him as the Sprout because Russell leads to Brussels, leads to Brussels sprouts, leads to the Sprout. No one knows who came up with the name first. We're incredibly mature. Jonah says it's hard to take the Sprout seriously because he's always using IE and EG in his sentences vigorously but interchangeably, a mark of weak character. He sometimes gives us little salutes when he sees us in the hall. Lately, he's been flashing the peace sign. 65% of the time, he acts like he's our friend, but we should remember the saying, friends don't fire friends. Sticks and carrots. 65% of the time is what the Sprout would call a guesstimate. He's always breaking things down into precise percentages. He used to be almost normal to talk to, But now he'll ask if we're on the same page and say something is a no-brainer, all in a single sentence. It's not just the frequency of these expressions, but their haphazard use. Last week, he told Laars to think outside the box. They were talking about which size manila folders worked best. Afterward, he said, keep me in the loop and let's touch base next week. Prue has wondered if the Sprout, a proud native of Canada, is taking a class in annoying American English. His new thing is a variation on, I gave you a carrot, but I also need to show you the stick. So far this month, he said it to Prue, to Jack 2, and to Laars. A league record. Softball is a morale-boosting carrot that the Sprout most likely has read about in a handbook or learned at that seminar he goes to every March. Morale has been low since the firings began last year. Prue says morale is a word thrown around only in the context of its absence. You never look at a hot young thing and say, check out that spring chicken, but only use it to describe your great aunt. She's no spring chicken. Prue has a point. We tend to trust her with her serious eyebrows and inevitable skeptical, She went to graduate school. We think it was in art history, but maybe it was regular history, the kind without the art. We decide to give softball a shot. There are 8 of us in decreasing order of height: Laars, Jack 2, Lizzie, Jonah, Jenny, Crease, Prue, and Jill. We need a 9th, and Jack 2 happens to bump into Otto, who used to be in IT. He's now working somewhere in Midtown and clearly has too much time on his hands. It might be nice to rejuvenate our comically untoned bodies. Too many of us have been eating bagels at our desk, too many mornings in a row. We look like we've been squeezed out of a tube and haven't quite solidified. Everyone has issues with posture except Lizzie, a corseter's dream. Laars and Jenny are the only ones who have ever played softball before. Laars at his last job, Jenny as a 7-year-old. The concept is that you try to hit the ball hard, but without so much upward arc that someone can catch it. Then you run in a square, or more properly a diamond, making sure to step on each base and not get tagged by someone bearing the ball. There are other rules that we never quite iron out. Lizzie is having trouble seeing the carrot aspect of the game. We buy mitts, glove oil, cleats. Laars buys 2 aluminum bats and 2 wooden ones. He buys a 3rd kind of bat, a titanium hybrid that looks like a nuclear warhead. Laars can be seen doing push-ups near the storage area, counting off under his breath. We have jerseys and caps printed with our emblem, a buxom elf, winking and holding a pool cue. Jill found it on some Finnish clip art site. We prematurely end our season after losing the first game 17-0, said to be a league record. What's left of our morale seeps away. We never see Otto again. All the gear gets returned, except the jerseys and caps. Autumn approaches, the air too cool for the jerseys, but we still wear the hats sometimes. I'll just read the next section and then we can talk again. The cult of Maxine. Maxine never officially joined the softball team, but bought a jersey from Jill, cutting the collar to create a plunging V. She still wears it on occasion, even as the weather turns nippy. Maxine towers over us in her medium heels. She makes us feel like hobbit folk with our stained teeth and ragamuffin outfits. With the exception of Laars, we have 0 upper body strength. We are moderately proud of our youthful haircuts and overpriced rectangular eyeglasses, but that's about it. She smells great, and we are all basically obsessed with her. It has to seriously stop, Lizzie says. Crease calls her aggressively hypnotic and can hardly bear to be within a 20-yard radius. He sometimes crosses himself after she passes, and he is not even Catholic. Her hair, Jack 2 will email out of the blue. Everyone knows whose hair he's talking about. Sharing an elevator ride alone with Maxine can be intensely disorienting. We try to avoid it. Several times of late, while waiting for the elevator at the end of the day, Kreese has sensed Maxine's approach, her distinctive shoe clack sending him darting in the other direction. In similar situations, Jenny has been known to mumble to herself, giving the impression that she's forgotten something at her desk. Jenny likes boys, but sometimes when Maxine is in the room, she's not so sure. Laars says Maxine smells like a rare hybrid fruit that you can only find at this one stall in a market in Kuala Lumpur. The worst is when you turn the corner and you see her and you want to say hi in a normal way, but all that happens is your mouth opens and you make a little croaking sound, or you make no noise at all. It was Jules, no longer among us, who first identified this phenomenon. There is so much to take in, not just her clothes or lack of clothes, not just her amazing hair, but her entire philosophy of being. You can detect an aspect of the beauty queen in her looks and high gloss appearance, her attention-yanking laugh, her borderline moronic statements. But Prue has argued in the landmark case Prue v. Jonah that she's not only not stupid, but definitely more accomplished than the rest of us. We don't know what's on that resume, but it doesn't matter. She's got that magic, that spark, utterly unclouded by self-doubt. Maxine is on a different track than the rest of us. She entered the office at a higher level, and we will never catch up. By the time we reach her current position, in the event we haven't burned out, drifted away, she will have scaled even greater heights, afloat on a cloud of boundless confidence and even more tantalizing aromas. All of this should be illustrated in the manner of a medieval vision of the afterlife. And I'll stop right there rather than jump ahead. I think that's good enough for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I hope that people who are listening to this and who haven't read the book can get a sense of how strange and transporting this writing is, not just because it's exceedingly well done, that is at the level of authorial skill, but there's something peculiar about it, even from within the tradition of really good novels. And I think most people will have noticed that the narrator seems to be in the first person plural. And in fact, as far as I can tell from having read the book, is never resolved into any one person or even any stable group of individuals, since the original softball team changes from time to time and people come and go. And I assume that was a deliberate choice on your part, but it certainly contributes to a strange feeling of unreality about the people we're describing. And there's a lot that goes along with it in the book. I'm sorry for going on so long. It's just, I've had so many thoughts about the book. But anyway, we don't know the name of the company that these people work for. We don't know what this company does. At one point, it suggested that they're in commerce. I think that's the closest that we come to any sense of what they do. You've said publicly that it was inspired by the Village Voice, but you also said that this is not the Village Voice, and that these are not journalists, and that journalists who thought that they ought to be in the book are not. They're fictional characters. And beyond that, our usual ways of telling people apart in books, description, for instance, different backstories, almost all of those are missing except a very few skeletal details. Maybe Prue went to grad school in art history or something. And this seems, I think, to occur even to the characters themselves, who are always telling each other they can't tell each other apart. At one point, two Asian workers, we're not told who or even who among these people are Asian, if any, are confused by the HR officer. So I wondered if you might just talk about the kind of pervasive sense of, I don't know, distance or unreality, which at the very least we get it in this first section of the three.
Yeah. Well, I think maybe we can put a pin in it, like the sense of unreality in the use of this collective we voice, first person plural. But when you mentioned there's a small, as you can tell from my reading, the book is broken up into 3 sections, and the first section has like these small segments, these, rarely longer than a page. And one of them is about 2 Asian coworkers whose someone in HR mixes up their names. And we don't actually know, like, one of the people in the book who we've been following, they could be in HR. Like, I never kind of say exactly who is doing what. But I think it's connected. I actually think the sense of unreality that, which is kind of maybe a personal aesthetic taste for me on one level, right? And the authors I like to read, et cetera. And kind of maybe the sometimes alienating experience of being in the workplace. Like, I think that definitely goes together, and we can say that's what it's about. But Ian, when you bring up that instance, I actually think there's something that I might not have been 100% conscious of when I was writing it, but there's something about this book, especially the first 2 sections. The third section is kind of its own kind of odd thing, but we get first names, right? We get people's first names, but we never get last names, as far to the best of my knowledge. And I remember writing this book before I knew it was a book, and I was just kind of like writing notes about work. I was making stuff up, kind of, like you said, inspired by my own day job, but changing the names. And it wasn't so much like, I don't want my real life coworker Darren to think that he's Otto, or something like that. I think there was a sense that I wanted to scramble, like, identity on a deeper level, so that if this is making sense to you, I guess what I'm trying to get at is, I wanted something inviting, especially in this early part of the book. Like, in a way, it was very strategic. Like, I wanted anyone to kind of read themselves into the book, and that meant not defining what the work was that they were doing. At some point in the manuscript, I was like, I should really figure out, like, do they work? At one point I thought maybe they work at like a coffee company, because like coffee is associated with work. But I was already 50 pages in, and I'm like, well, I've gotten this far already and it seems to be working, then let's forget it. Let's leave that in the dark. But when I say inviting, I think I also mean that, particularly with Asian Americans, like, the last name is very defining, right? I mean, there you will see non-Asians, who traditionally had the last name Park, but for Koreans, that was a Western sounding name that was a pretty, okay phoneticization of the actual Korean name. So not just Koreans, but any kind of, Japanese names are very distinctive, Chinese names. So I think part of me was like, almost like allowing, let's say, a reader like me to be like, oh wait, these characters, one of them could be me. And the more time that has passed from writing the book, I'm just kind of convinced that at some level I was like trying to have that invitation to the reader, and also to play against preconceptions. Like, we talked about like spoilers, and we'll try to avoid them, but there is one key racial thing that comes up later in the book, and I think one of the things I definitely knew I was doing it when I was writing it was to make the reader surprised. Like, they would assume a certain race for this character that was not true. And I mean, it's a little gimmicky on one level, but I think it's also, I just wanted to have fun with it in terms of gently interrogating the reader in terms of like how one reads a book and what assumptions you make.
One of the characters actually has the no definite first name, and that's a woman referred to as Kay. And since you mentioned your own kind of interest in past literature, I was curious if you meant this as a tribute to Kafka, or if this is because Kay's role is quite different from the Kay of Kafka novels. But anyway,
right. Yeah, I mean, to some degree, yeah. Kafka, I think Kafka as a state of mind, I think suffuses so much of, modern literature, and there's definitely kind of a nod to Kafka. There's also, if I'm remembering correctly, there's like a throwaway character who's like mentioned a couple times named Bernhard, which was my tip of the hat to Thomas Bernhard, the Austrian writer. So there are little kind of sort of literary jokes that I also wanted to be sort of, they're there if you want them, but you can also just like, that's just a name and go on. But Kay is kind of hard to think of anybody other than Kafka. There's also a figure called the unnameable, which is Beckett. I guess there's a lot of that in there. I've forgotten it, but it's in there, yeah.
Yeah, you once mentioned that you were, at least when you were younger, inspired by Nabokov, and it has some of the same kind of prismatic references to all sorts of things. It's part of what I think makes it such a delightful novel, and yet one of the weird things about the novel is its interest in sort of corporate speak. You gave some examples of that. Guesstimate, thinking outside the box, carrot and stick, and so forth. My only rule is there are no rules. Stuff like that. And then there's this whole kind of piece in the center called the Gilead, where this kind of language and thinking is made to speak. And I don't know exactly how to put it. It's one of the things I just found so striking about the book is how in these kind of mundane discussions of corporate speak, real literature is somehow produced. And I'm curious about, what you saw as the role of this kind of language in the book, and how you think about it, and more generally, if you can remember all these questions, why this kind of language proliferates in corporate America in a way that it perhaps doesn't in other spheres of life.
Right. That's a great question. I think what's interesting is I do love Nabokov, and I definitely did as a even more 30 years ago, whenever, like let's say in my early 20s, and let's say in my 20s, and then I kind of, he was almost so his own, just floating on a cloud of, like a medieval vision of the afterlife. Like there's something about him that was almost so unattainable, and it certainly structured a lot of how I think about the potential of writing, like what heights it can reach and so forth. You mentioned Charles Portis, who wrote True Grit. You mentioned that earlier. So I'm a fan of Portis's as well. And he sort of was the opposite, like this sort of the American vernacular. Not that Nabokov, he is an American writer in a lot of his books in a really special way. But there's something about the way Portis can take there's a, it's a great, it's hard for me to talk about Portis without laughing, but there's a great, his amazing book, The Dog of the South, where he can just, somebody puts a flyer in somebody's car, basically like, call me to sell me your car. And it's just like, we if you ever see somebody sticking something in your car windshield, like this piece of junk, like we're annoyed, right? But in Portis's hands, like it becomes this kind of, first it becomes like a recurring joke, and then it becomes something almost like more cosmic, right? I think Nabokov did this as well in a weird way. In the books that are set in America, so like in Pale Fire and Lolita, like and Panine, I guess, but more so those other two, where he's taking, and he's coming in as like, an exile, an alien, and taking kind of the cliches of, magazines and ads on the side of the road, and kind of giving them new life. And I guess maybe this sort of will lead me to the second part of of what you're saying, like why do I have this interest in sort of corporate speak? You mentioned there's a part in Personal Days in the second part of the book where they discover quotations from self-help books, business type of self-help books, and I made up a bunch of quotes, and I made up the books just kind of randomly. Here's one. It's from a book called The Business Warrior's 30-Day Mental Fitness Plan, revised edition by Cody Waxing, founder of MTech Solutions. The quote is, my father used to say that impossible situations require intestinal fortitude. Think about that word, intestinal. Every morning before coming into the office, ask yourself this simple 5-word question: do I have the guts? Much hinges on your answer. Just like, they're pretty funny. I haven't thought about these in a while. And I think partly it's just my own, to amuse myself. I think it's also, without giving it away, but there's a person in the book, in Personal Days, who is typing these things out. And I think there's a certain sadness, right? Because it's somebody who's kind of been exiled from the rest of the group and trying to find her way. So I wanted to kind of do both things, but just the idea of cliche, I feel like it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing if you're a writer. Like if you can find a way, your writing shouldn't be cliched, but if you can take cliches that are out there and kind of get inspired by them, I think it can be really wonderful. And the writer who comes to mind, another writer who comes to mind is William Gaddis, who worked in corporate America for decades, and especially in his book JR, he's just taking all that input and like giving it to you, full blast. It's an amazing book.
Well, let me change the subject a little and just ask a question that I think will occur to most people who read the book. And it occurred to me, since I'm like most people.
That's right.
And that is, a lot of the drama in the book, for those who haven't had a chance to read it yet, turns on the question, who's going to be fired and when, and in what order, and will everyone, or will it just be some? And all of these people are, it would appear at least, terrified of getting laid off or canned or whatever you want to call it. And the question I had, and that they themselves may have, is why that is. Given that it seems fairly miserable in this office, they're all sort of decompensating in various ways. And not only that, but the tales that they've heard of people who've left are generally success stories, people who go on to do wonderful things. Sometimes, they start businesses of their own, they write screenplays or various things. So why do these people not want to be fired, or why are they so attached to this place?
Yeah, I think what it is there's, it's in some senses it's a company where misery loves company. Like there's a way that they are attached to each other, even though they might, there's a fair amount of like gossiping, and there's some people don't like each other as much as others, but I think for all of these characters who there's a reason why they're kind of interchangeable, at least in the first part. There's something about being with these people. There's a passage where somebody realizes you see these people more than you see close members of your family, your spouse if you have one, your significant others. Like there's you're in a back in the olden times of the early aughts, you are with them for the better part of the day, and then often that'll extend afterwards, right? Like the kind of workplace traditions and workplace parties, going out to drink for drinks and things like that. So there's like, I think they're joking around and they're complaining and they're I think what they're really afraid of is losing that sort of that kind of friendship. I guess there's no other word, and in that sense, like I'm amping up the drama of getting fired and sort of how tragic that would be, but maybe it's just as I get older, like there's something kind of sad about it too, like that once you leave, you're never actually going to connect with these people as much, and to your point, like there are a few mentions of people who have left, but nobody has really established any kind of continuing relationship with them. So I think that's what they're secretly perhaps most afraid of.
They're afraid of falling off, being nothing anymore to this group.
Even though perhaps they should be a life coach or somebody, or one of these how-to books, self-help books would maybe say like this is to get to your next stage of your evolution as a human or something, but for now they're too scared to lose what they have.
One of the things that's striking about the book is the tripartite structure. So in the first bit, it's written in a kind of good-natured first person plural, and then it changes quite abruptly into the second part. So I wondered if you might just describe what's happening in the second.
So the second part, which I would read from, but it's the way it's sort of formatted makes it slightly difficult to read. It's kind of like an outline of some sort of document, right? I mean, so the tone kind of carries over from the first part, and at least I hope it's funny, but the level, the sort of ratio of kind of humor to menace tilts in the favor of menace. And I think the outline form where it's like Roman numeral, capital letter, etc. I think that it kind of does a lot of the work. Like it's sort of, you can read it easily enough, but at the back of your mind, you're thinking, who is writing this document? Why am I reading it? Is this some sort of, I think the connection that I think a lot of readers will make is this some sort of, internal document, something provided by a mole within the company to inform they're called the Californians. Since the book takes place in New York, these Californians are rumored to be taking over. Like, is it to sort of get the dirt on what, how the company really functions and kind of point out the flaws and things like that. So it goes from a first person plural in the first part to a kind of third person, but also sort of weirdly, uncannily omniscient. Like it's not a straight, like just the facts type of thing. There's definitely like a vibe of somebody perhaps like compiling this document. And the third part we can talk about later, if you want, or I can talk about it now. But that's also different as well.
Why did you want to shift the style so abruptly in two different parts of the book?
Yeah, I think, one reason is like, I like books that keep me on my toes. I like books that are trying something different, But all that aside, honestly, one thing that happened with the voice that I read, in earlier in this meeting, like there's it's a very kind of, the first person plural is a really like enveloping voice, like the we voice, like the reader is embraced in this, right? But I also, and I want it to be very funny, but I also, when I hit about page 50 or 60, I was like, I like what it's doing, but I can't do this for, another 100 pages or even another 50 pages. Like, and I think it's almost like, it sounds a little bit mystical, but sometimes as a writer, like, especially with short stories, if you're writing a short story, it's like fairly, it's pretty finite, right? In terms of page length and stuff. And if you get the voice, you can just write it through. Like the voice, you've got the voice and you can just go. And it's going to end at, 10, 15, 20 pages, and you don't have to think about it again. And this is sort of, my first novel. Like I realized like I can't just keep going with it if I'm not feeling it. So that actually what in some cases might be a liability, I felt like actually helped structure the novel. And I was like, okay, let's say this voice has to end at page 70. It's like 60 or 70. And then what's next in terms of the book and in terms of the plot, such that it is. So I did the next voice for what we were just talking about for a little while. And then it's almost like everything came to a head and I was like, everything's been so regimented and like broken down, and I need to push against that. So I want like one person to talk, or in this case to write, as long as he wants, and as overflowing with emotion in a way that the first two parts were not. So that's kind of the some of this is in hindsight, but I definitely remember coming to these places in the construction of the book where I'm like, now we have to move on to the next mode because I've exhausted this one. And, I don't think every book has to be like that, but that's just how it worked out.
In the third section, which you mentioned, we find a 16,000 word or so sentence. And you actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about long sentences in books.
Yeah.
Although you were modest enough not to mention your own in the op-ed.
In the article itself, yeah, that might have been a little too self-serving. But,
but no, I don't think so. Anyway, it's a delightful op-ed actually, and I recommend it to everyone to take a look at it. But I wondered if you might talk in a general way about the appeal of what you call, using capital letters, the very long sentence.
Yeah. Well, I think as a writer, it's very inspiring. Like it's almost like suddenly there are no rules, and which might sound scary to some people or to some readers. Is definitely not for everybody, but it's a chance to sort of use everything you got, right? Lay it on the table. You know how punctuation works. You know how grammar works. What is it you want to say? And like, let's, for me, it was like, let's put it all in this kind of very different style than the rest of the book. Since this is an office novel, I immediately was like, there has to be some justification for it. And so I kind of came up with this thing. It's essentially a very long email written on a laptop where the period key is broken. So I gave it a very mechanical reason for being. But I think when it works, when these kind kinds of extravagant literary, you can call them gimmicks, strategies, you know, when they work, they're really great because most readers, you know, we don't encounter it that much. And so I think if one of the goals for a certain kind of novelist is to like kind of make the reader feel new things or give them kind of a new experience, that's one way to do it. And I really, you know, kind of it was probably the hardest part of the book to write, even though it flows, right? It's a very long sentence that goes, I want to say it stretches around, it's around 40 pages. Yeah, it's about 40 pages. And, you know, writing part 2, I kind of had the idea that that's what part 3 would be, right? And it just was very clear in my mind. It was hard, you know, the difficulty was in like writing it in a way that was convincingly what somebody might write on a laptop in dire circumstances. And so every kind of emotion had to be in there. And it also explains actually the rest of the book. Like it's a bit of a cheat in that way, but I was able to like get everything, kind of explain everything that the reader has been reading up to that point, in doing that. And, you know, like, you know, I wrote that article that you mentioned, and so there are precedents for it. And, you know, the most famous one is the end of Ulysses, where it's Molly Bloom's soliloquy, and it's kind of broken up into a bunch of like mega paragraphs. There's no period, but there's like a little bit of white space. But, you know, I would consider it like a single sentence that's kind of flowing outward. So I just think that's I think Ulysses is such a great book, but one of the things I remember best about that book is like coming to the end. And I remember it was like, I had been reading it all night, and it was like, I want to say it's like 5 a.m. or something. And it's just like, it's almost like this gift of like this rapturous thing that, you know, I think I knew it was coming, but just to kind of get that at the end of this incredible book, like, you know, you want to, if I can kind of transmit that sort of feeling to the reader, I mean, why not go for it?
So we have a few questions from the participants.
Great.
I'm going to read. This one is from Lynn. She says, Ed, the voice in this book is so strong. Curious about how much you think about voice.
I think most of the times it's all or nothing. Like, I think if you don't have a voice, it's, and I wish it weren't like this, but if you don't have a voice, you don't have a book, you don't have a story, you don't have a short story. I'm not a poet, but you probably don't have a poem either. So, you know, I have ideas of things I'd like to write, even in nonfiction, like just ideas of things to write. But I guess I would say, like, if I can't find the right vehicle in terms of the voice to do it, then I can't, like, it's hard to do it. I guess the flip side is that if I want something bad enough, like, I'm working on a novel right now, and it was, you know, kind of mostly all done, but I realized, oh, there needs to be a chapter here, like kind of 1/3 of the way into the book. There doesn't need to be, but it'd be great to have one that's set in the 70s in New York, and kind of close to where I live now. But I've kind of been living here in this general area for a long time, and I've passed by the buildings. I want to do that, and I'm going to use some of the characters from earlier in the book, but like backdate. So the frame of the book is kind of more or less today or a few years ago, but I'm going to have a couple of them as young, like people in the 70s, like I guess some of the older characters are now younger. And I just was like, I want to write this. And like, I guess if you want it bad enough, like, even though there are false starts and you're not finding the voice, like, after, you know, if you keep trying, like, and you want it bad enough, like, hopefully the voice will emerge from that. So that's what happened with that section. But there are definitely like stories I've tried to write where I just can't find the voice, or else I think I have a voice and then the voice runs out. The other thing I will say, which I'm just reminded of, is I think like a lot of writers, I have like all these abandoned stories and abandoned things that were maybe going to become books, or I didn't know what they would be, and they just stop. And then they're all on my hard drive. And so sometimes I'm searching for something and I'll be like, oh, one of these abandoned stories will come out. And I'll start reading. I'm like, oh, this is really, I'm really liking this. This was like, it's like 10 years old, but wow, why didn't, and then it just stops. And I'm like, oh, I guess I ran out of the voice there. And, part of me is like, I should just, 10 years have passed, I should just finish it. And that usually doesn't work out so well. But one thing I did in two places for this current book that I'm working on is I did find these things that I then imported into the novel, changed the names of some of the characters, and it kind of became like, they became sort of like with the New York City in the 70s, like earlier versions of some of these current day characters, using an abandoned story from, I think one of them is from like the late 90s. Like they've just been hanging around. Some of them I had emailed to myself, so they only exist on email. Yeah, I got off topic, but those are the dangers of, when you lose your voice, I guess.
This next question, so they say, I loved the use of the headers and titles for each segment in the first section. Can you talk about the decision to use these?
Yeah, I think I was trying to, on some level, write the most inviting kind of opening. So I wanted to, not that I don't trust the reader. It's more like I didn't fully trust myself. Like I wanted it to be something where if I picked it up in a bookstore, I would get hooked. And I think using those headers, like I think that happened maybe not immediately in the writing process, but I think when they started occurring to me, I was like, oh, if I'm enjoying writing these, it probably means the reader's going to enjoy reading them. And they almost look like little headers in like a newspaper article, perhaps. And I mean, that I guess that sort of flashed in my mind. But there's like a way of, you'll note, these are very short segments. And I think there was also the worry that maybe they would just be kind of a little too free floating. So I wanted to like nail it down a little bit for the reader.
So this anonymous attendee asks, I saw the COVID piece you wrote. Are you working on anything fiction or nonfiction currently? I'm just trying to really work, as Ian mentioned, Personal Days came out a long time ago. So I've been working on this new novel. It's been several years now. I didn't start it right after Personal Days. Like I feel like kind of like a lot of life stuff going on. But for the last, I don't actually want to say because it's too scary, but I feel like for the last several years, I've been working on this novel. It's quite different in a lot of ways from Personal Days. There is kind of an office, there are 3 threads in it, and one of them is sort of an office, kind of an office novel. There's like office stuff going on. It's not the main thing about it, but it is, there's some of that kind of corporate speak in it, and there's some email, things like that, to kind of give it a sort of modern frame. But then the other 2 threads of it, one of them I've mentioned, kind of the historical one in terms of like a scene set in the 70s, a scene set in the 90s, and so on, kind of up through the decades. And then there's an even more historical one that is kind of like a book within a book. And I won't get too into it now, but there's a lot of sort of Korean, I would even say Korean American history, sort of like early, so almost like turn of the century Koreans who found themselves in America, who came to America for whatever reason, and who were independence fighters for Korea, which was colonized by Japan back then. So that kind of forms the
the core of it. But one thing that, you know, I'll mention, since this is, even though I'm here in New York, this is like my hometown audience, is there's a strand of it where, you know, every Buffalonian's favorite historical topic, the Pan American Exposition, is kind of in it. You know, I've been fascinated by that definitely when I was growing up, but even, you know, here in New York, like I always kind of think about it. I'm always kind of reading about it. So that's in there as well. And I kind of, the assassination of McKinley is kind of used as a template for these other assassinations, actual assassinations that happened after it. And I don't think the assassins were thinking of the McKinley assassination, but the accounts I read, there's something they do in terms of as they prepare to assassinate, you know, these important figures, that there was just this kind of uncanny resonance. So I kind of used it. It was a way, I guess, of merging Buffalo and Korea in a way, because even though I've lived in New York for many years, like in some ways, like that's the core of who I am, right? Still follow the Savers and the Bills, and, you know, bemoan the lack of good chicken wings here. So
this last Q&A question, also from an anonymous attendee, they ask, speaking of James Joyce, have you ever spent time in UB's Joyce collection? And they also ask, what are your thoughts on Finnegan's Wake? And they thought that the ending felt very Joyce-like.
Well, I feel like out of my depth here. I know about UB's Joyce collection. I was not, you know, so I left Buffalo after high school. So and I didn't read Joyce until later in college. So I've never kind of gone back to investigate, but I've read about it online, if that counts. And I've never been able to get through Finnegan's Wake. I'm sad to say, and I don't know, I think it was earlier in the pandemic, I found my copy and I was like, maybe it's a great time to read it. And it was like a pretty new copy when I bought it, but the pages were like, so they'd kind of gotten foxed, I guess. They're very kind of, they're not readable anymore, really. So I kind of put that idea aside, but I have read the end of Finnegan's Wake. And so I would say that's definitely something I had thought about, as well as the end of Ulysses, when writing Personal Days. And I think maybe I'm too much of a Nabokovian, because he loved Ulysses, and he called Finnegan's Wake dismissively. He called it Punnigan's Wake. Like, he couldn't stand it. He thought it was bad. So it's probably time I stopped listening to him. But
so that was the last of the Q&A questions. If anyone else has a question for Ed, please put it in the Q&A and I'll ask away. Ian, do you have any more questions?
Yes, of course. I could go on and on, but we are going to stop at 8. I promise. Okay. But I'm very grateful for the chance to put these questions to you. So one of the things, speaking of these long sentences that you mentioned in the Times op-ed, was that Twitter requires people to write very short sentences, and the posts are 140 characters. You used to have a Twitter feed,
oh yeah,
and you seem to have canceled it. So I was curious about why.
I canceled myself before anyone could cancel me. I think I'm trying to remember when exactly I canceled it. I mean, this is a cliche. I think it was probably after. I'm pretty sure it was after the 2016 election. And I got off Facebook around that time too. And I kind of enjoyed Facebook, to be honest. And I actually got to connect with a lot of, as everyone does, like older friends, but especially actually friends from high school and friends from Buffalo. And I just felt a little bit, or a great deal, dispirited by things, but also you know, politics aside, like I just didn't feel like these were good, these were healthy, healthy things to be doing. And I actually, you know, I honestly don't miss them. You know, sometimes I will go on Twitter, I guess, and you know, see what's trending and whatnot. But I think it's good to not always have to engage in things. And I think also, you know, as a writer, and maybe this is just me being old school, because I think there are plenty of writers who are, you know, they're happy to engage in this stuff, and I think it gives them energy, but it feels a little depleting to me. And as I get older, it's like, do I want to like craft this like really zingy tweet, you know, about whatever, or even like a joke, like, you know, it's mostly I just like joked around, but it's like, I got to word it really well so that people like it. But it's sort of, yes, but you're not writing your book. Like, it's like, not that you can only do one thing, but it just felt draining emotionally and draining time-wise. So I do Instagram, which is just pictures. so I don't have to use words for that. But I also think, you know, if there's something I feel strongly enough about, you know, I could try to write an article about it, right? Or if there's a writer who, you know, I try to read a lot, and if there's a writer who I think is really great or important, or somebody from the past that I think people should read, maybe I should try to write about it in a longer form, like an essay, and get it published. So, you know, that's the reason for leaving those platforms.
And you also were the proprietor of something like 9 blogs at various points. And have you given up on blogging also, or is that?
I think nobody blogs. I mean, I'm sure some people do, but I can't remember the last time I looked at a blog. I think I stopped probably around, it's probably been at least a decade since I've blogged anything. So, you know, I had kind of one main blog, which was, you know, mostly, a lot of it was visual, but I would also like, you know, stuff I've been reading, blah, 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 you know, usual things people do. And the others were like more collaborative. Like I would do it with other people. And there's one actually that's a Beatles blog that I kind of started with 2 friends who I knew were Beatles. Oh, no, actually more than 2, just like fellow Beatles fans, I guess. But they've written much more. One of them is a guy named Devin McKinney, who's written this great book called Magic Circles about the Beatles. Another is a guy named Michael Gerber, who's also written Beatles books. And so they kind of like they just kind of ran with it. I felt like I was the instigator. You know, I came up with the name, I brought into being, and then I was just happy to let them run with it. And I've actually checked that blog within the last, you know, year or so, and they're still posting stuff, and it's pretty fun. But it just seems like it's weird because there are no blogs in personal days, and now I think blogs are pretty much like an artifact of that period of the digital era. Like it's much more, you know, social media or like, you know, non-verbal, even like TikTok or whatever. So, which I don't do, by the way.
One of the other things that you have done is you edited this book called Buffalo Noir, which I think came out about 5 years ago, maybe a little longer. And I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about your interest in noir. I assume that it's obvious why you'd be interested in Buffalo, but you know, this book, Personal Days, also has certain characteristics of noir novels, and I just wondered if you might speak to the kind of noir tradition.
Yeah, I mean, this is the book Buffalo Noir. It's part of Akashic Books. They have a series, different cities, so New York Noir, Boston Noir, different countries actually. I don't know how many, there are dozens of them now, but you know, it kind of, just in very literal terms, like the book started because the publisher of Akashic, a guy named Johnny Temple, asked me and our mutual friend Bridget Hughes, who some of you might know, is she edits the journal, the excellent journal, Public Space. She was an editor at the Paris Review. She was the editor of the Paris Review for a while. And she and I, we actually went to the same high school, Nichols, and she's sort of like, and I like sort of knowing Buffalo people in New York and in the publishing world. But anyway, so Johnny knew that we knew each other, and I think he came up with the idea, and it took Bridget and I like actually a couple. It's not a very long book, but we were both busy, so it took a while to pull together. But in terms of like the appeal to me, I think is just, I mean, who isn't a fan of, you know, noir films or mysteries? You know, I feel like I go through phases where that's all I want to read. Some of my favorite writers are mystery writers. And, you know, I was just thinking about, there's this great noir movie called Detour that somebody mentioned just a couple days ago, and which I only watched about a year ago. And just I feel like good noir, I'm using mystery and noir a little bit interchangeably, but in terms of like atmosphere and in terms of like a kind of elaborating on this sense of doom, I think noir does it. I think that's what noir, that's kind of at the heart of noir, and that's what makes the really good ones just irresistible. So, you know, I do when I was in Buffalo, there was my local library near my parents' place. Nobody really, my wife doesn't know this, like they were having a free books in the book room, come. And I just had a bag with me, and I just like shoveled, there was like an Agatha Christie book, there was this detective, Robert B. Parker's Spencer book, you know, John Dixon Carr, like but to me it was like Christmas. Like I was just these old mysteries and noir books that you know, that I can now read. I think you're correct. There's definitely an element in Personal Days, especially kind of like the ending is very noir. Let's put it that way. I mean, a run-on sentence that's 40 pages is not really noir, but the sort of situation is actually quite noir. My current book has chapters that are I would characterize in that way, although the whole thing is I wouldn't call it noir. It's something else. I'm not sure what it is.
So we've been talking a little bit about the book's ending and trying not to give away the main elements of the mystery, which I think lies at the heart of the last 2/3 of it, and perhaps the whole thing. But it seems like, without giving anything specific away, it would be worth just asking you why you decided to call this book Personal Days, a phrase that recurs throughout the book,
Yeah.
and which all of us who've worked in offices are familiar with anyway. But of course, there are lots of other things you could have called it. So I'm just curious how you arrived at that title.
Sure, it's interesting, and there's also Buffalo connection. The working title was something else, and I was very literally like, I mean, I'll tell you what happened. A friend of mine, who turned out to be the editor of this book, editor named Julia Chaffetz, who plays an important role in my life, and who I know through a past guest on the book club, Jessica Winter. They went to high school together. Anyway, Julia, I didn't know Julia in Buffalo, but Jessica put us in touch, and Julia had just been promoted within Random House, and we had lunch, and she, you know, what are you writing? Are you writing a novel? And I described the novel. I was like, it's a workplace novel, blah, blah. And she thought about it for like 2 seconds, and she said, Personal Days. So she's like, that's the title. I was like, and I loved it. I actually thought there was something about that phrase, that term, which, as you said, and you know, if you work in an office, you know what it is, but you also don't know what it is. It's like it's such a nebulous term, because you could use them let's say you run out of sick days, you could use them for that. Like you can augment a vacation maybe, or are you not supposed to? Is it like a mental health day? Is it a is it kind of a euphemism for I'm looking for another job on this day? It's like some things come up. I'm not sick. I'm not on vacation. This is a personal day. So I liked that kind of ambiguity, and it really, for those of you who haven't read the book, you probably get a sense that there is that kind of at the heart of a lot of personal days, there is that kind of like surreal sensation of like, what's going on here. And I think it's a perfect title for the book. I don't know if everyone loves it, but I certainly, when she said it, it like actually crystallized a lot of things for me. I hadn't quite finished the book, but I was almost done, and I then worked the title into the book. So it doesn't happen every day, but yeah.
I see, and of course, just as you said, in the book, personal days is sometimes spelled with a Z because there's a program that's supposed to listen to what people say and write it out, and it spells T-D-A-Z-E rather
right, that's right.
by S. And that sort of adds to the sense of confusion. Some of the characters even come into the office on their personal days, and others spend their personal days tracking other people from the office or spying or
right.
carrying out various quixotic missions that they've cooked up for themselves. It's an interesting thought that these are people's personal days, and yet they seem not to somehow spend them in any kind of personal way, but rather sort of give them back to the office, as if they've lost their personality outside of work. And I guess I was thinking maybe that's one of the reasons they're so scared of getting fired, like they wouldn't know who they are anymore if they didn't work there. Right. But I don't know. I guess I feel tempted to ask, and you don't have to answer if it's too personal, but you yourself eventually did get fired from the Village Voice, didn't you? I mean, not for a cause, but because the whole place was going under. And I wonder if you hadn't yet published the book when that happened, right? No. It came out after. So I wondered how that experience contributed. And you don't have to talk about anything.
No, I'm happy to talk about it. I started writing the book before I was laid off. So there were waves of layoffs happening. I mean, I guess there's technically a difference between a layoff and a firing. In the book, for dramatic effect, it's a firing, right? But but in some respects, there are parallels. Like the company was sold, people from outside of New York kind of came in, and I had been at The Voice for quite a while, I think 10 or 11 years. But before that, I saw other people who had been there for decades, like, some legendary writers and editors of much experience. And just that was really tough to see, I mean, my own case, that's like, that was rough. Like when it happened, I anticipated it and it happened. But I think it was more like these earlier phases where I was still in the office, and just like to see the office space kind of getting cleared out was, I'm sure a lot of people have had this experience, but it's pretty unnerving. And as we've kind of been, the word surreal, like it's just somebody's not there anymore. And so yes, I had been writing, and I should also say, this wasn't the first novel that I wrote. I had written a couple of other books that had never gotten published, but I think there's something, I mean, I think there's a lesson in this perhaps, that there was something so, you know, I guess cathartic in the writing, but also just, it was personal, like to get back to that word, like it was both complete fiction, but also like very much, I wouldn't have written this had I not had some, you know, experience in terms of what that atmosphere was like and how that felt. So I can thank, in retrospect, I should be thankful that happened. And of course, the voice since then has sort of like self-destructed, and it's really kind of only been a website. It's not anything really now, but there were greater forces that caused that, I think. But I think my interest was to look at the sort of the human toll, I guess, the people who this is going to affect on a day-to-day basis.
One of the things you describe, I think, really beautifully and insightfully in the book is what you call the layoff narrative. And I'll just read a section of the book that I noted for myself because it's relevant here. The idea is that you look back on your period of employment, highlight all the abuses suffered, tallied the lessons gained, and use these negatives and positives to mentally withstand what you anticipate will be a series of events culminating in expulsion. You look to termination as rebirth, liberation, and expansion of horizons. So I'm curious, if you yourself constructed one of these layoff narratives in the context of the kind of devolution of the voice.
I mean, I guess in a meta way, like that became the layoff narrative, was that it led me to write this book. Like the book was actually what this was building toward. I mean, that puts a lot of pressure on the book, I think, but there's something, I mean, we all kind of, we live our lives and stuff happens to us, and we do things, we get what we want, we don't get what we want. And then it's, it's only much later that you, what am I saying? Like, while it's happening, you're thinking, you're sure you're right, or you think this is what's going on. And then, you pull back later and you see kind of maybe more of a pattern in what had happened back then. And and actually some of my favorite writers will do that. Like they can take great spans of time and sort of give it structure and give it meaning. And I think that's something very, it's just one of the things that I think a novel does best, really.
One of the characters in the book, whose name is Jules, he's not exactly much of a character since he's not in the in-group, but he exists sort of on as a former employee. He writes a screenplay in his last days at the office. 150 pages of fast-moving, wisecracking, bittersweet dialogue is how you describe it. And then he gets fired and the screenplay comes to an end. And the thing you say there is that somehow it's harder to write now that he doesn't work in the office. And since this book was, I think, maybe, I don't know, maybe like mostly written while you were working at The Voice, but then sort of finished when you weren't there anymore. I wonder if you think that's true. Was it harder to write after you weren't in the office?
Not in terms of finishing this book. Like I actually, and it amazes me now, like I guess I had written quite a bit of it, but upon getting laid off, I think it was also the fear of, oh my God, like I better finish this book. And I actually, maybe there wasn't much left, but I finished it pretty soon, like within a couple months after it. So I was mostly there. In terms of my work, my writing life and work life in general, it's hard for me to say. I think it's definitely, maybe I'm just getting older. definitely easier to write for me when I'm not working somewhere full time. But it you know, your mileage may vary. I think, you know, a lot of that is also sort of Personal Days came out, and then wait, when did it come out? 2008. So, but during the writing of it, I didn't have any kids, and then I had 2 kids, and so you very suddenly kind of get a sense of, you know, what your limits are. But now that they're a little bit older, hopefully I can recalibrate that balance again.
I know there's a comment that, Michaela, would you be kind enough to read from a friend of Ed's?
Sure. This one is from Paula Yu from college. She left you a comment here in the chat.
Nice. Wow.
She had joined us and she was having a great time listening to the discussion.
Oh, that's great. I will just, I haven't seen Paula in 20 some, I mean, I haven't seen her since college. I will just mention she just came out with a book about Vincent Chin, who some of you might know, but very important case in Asian American history, Chinese American who was beaten to death in Detroit, and it became kind of like the spark for a lot of sort of Asian American identity and activism and things like that. Anyway, it's called From a Whisper to a Rallying Cry, and I've actually been listening to it on audiobook, which is something I haven't really done much since this year. I actually wrote something that became an audiobook on Audible, so that got me into listening to people's audiobooks. So anyway, it's great, and it's one of those books her book that sort of, she did a lot of fresh research, so I'm learning stuff about it that I had never known before. So anyway, I don't know if Paul is still here, but thank you for joining.
Ian, any last question? Maybe we have time for one last question. And
it's almost 8. I've had so much fun. I didn't realize how much time has passed, but yes.
Quite a bit of time. And Ian has been an extraordinary facilitator. I really
thank you so much.
want to thank you for that. So one last question, Ian.
All right. So I wondered if you might just speak about this thing you describe in the book called, you say that there was a ruler, a chieftain in Mexico who ruled by confusion. He would tell his subjects that a tribe was attacking from the north. Then later in the day, tell them the tribe had been spotted coming from the south, and so on. And this seems to be some kind of metaphor for what's happening in the office, where people are getting all kinds of different messages. And I'm curious about this because it strikes me as a kind of really profound insight into the nature of authority. And I wondered if you might just talk a little bit about your own kind of thoughts on this phenomenon of ruling by confusion.
I think it was also probably a commentary on my own writing process. Like not, I wanted everything to be clear, but it's sort of like, I think I did have enough self-consciousness to realize I was doing a lot of, different things. And if a book is a kind of, little kingdom or country, perhaps seeing how much of that the book could bear. Yeah, I remember that part. It's funny thinking back on it because it's clearly something I just made up, but there is that idea of the coworkers belonging to the same tribe, and this idea of somebody, if the sprout, one of the figures, kind of the authority figures I mentioned, if he's not kind of all together with it, is it actually Maxine who holds the power? Is it Kay? Is it Jill, this other character who, kind of mysteriously is writing these self-help business quotes? It's funny you picked up on that particular passage, because I think I would just say, like, in my favorite books, like, you can kind of take something and it serves as a metaphor for the entire book. For those of you who've read Nicholson Baker's The Mezzanine, I feel like that book, any sentence of it actually contains the whole book. Like, there's something like that. So I'm very happy you picked up on it, because I think there's something there that that actually explains, at least some of the method for putting it together. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And let's turn it over to Mary, who's going to give us valediction.
I'd be happy to. To start with, please join us again in 2 short weeks on August 18th, again at 6:30 p.m. as we welcome Lawrence Spann, who wrote a new book. I think it's his first book, A Parable of Lies. Our friend and often facilitator, Kate Sudant, was his babysitter, and she brought him to my attention. So we're delighted to have him. And then again, our regular book club will be the first Thursday in September. Dr. Christopher Kerr's book, Death is But a Dream. Dr. Kerr is head of the hospice here in Buffalo, New York, and he wrote a book based upon the dreams of people just prior to their death, and has received much great acknowledgement for that work. So some wonderful things coming. But this Sunday at 1:30, I invite everybody to the center for our first of 8 artist talks, artists who are currently in the new exhibition, Art and Craft Media. I hope you'll join us. There's 5 artists coming in this Sunday, and the next one will be the last Friday in August, and then 1 Sunday and 1 Friday throughout the course of the show, and that can be found on our website. Michaela has something she'd like to share real quickly.
Yeah. So on Saturday, August 14th, we're going to host our in-person family day, which is the first one since 2020 in February. So we're really excited to get families back in the building to create art and see the artwork in person. Please register in advance, and it's via my email. I'm going to share a link to the event information in the chat. We want to make sure there is, enough room for capacity and everything, because mask and social distancing are being observed while at the virtual penny. So I will put that in the chat, and I look forward to having everyone join us for Saturday Family Day.
And the last word is Ian. Thank you so much. I'm so glad you jumped in and decided to facilitate this book. Again, you did an extraordinary job. It was really nice getting to know you. And Ed, thank you for a really interesting book and a wonderful conversation. And I appreciate both of you very much. And I hope you'll join us for future book clubs. Thank you, everyone.
My pleasure. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And I'll see you at the Birchfield Penny Arts Center, hopefully in the near future. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.